She said it in Korean. Leaned down, 4 words, didn't wait for a response. The entire table went still. The clink of silverware against porcelain stopped dead. Orlan Merk stopped mid-sentence. His smile didn't fall. It froze. The kind of freeze that happens when a man realizes, in real time, that he's been caught. Not suspected. Caught. Rian Sokha didn't move. Didn't look at Merk. Didn't look at the contract that would have sold his empire for pennies. He looked at her, this woman who had no business being at this table, no business speaking his language, and absolutely no business knowing that the men waiting in the parking garage downstairs were not valets. In that 3-second, chandelier-humming silence, $40 million, and the lives of every man in that room hung in the balance. Who is she? Why is she really here? And how does a woman with that kind of knowledge end up at the exact table, at the exact moment, when the most dangerous man in Atlanta is about to sign his own death warrant? Stay with me, because nothing about tonight is a coincidence. Zainara Vell had been invisible for 3 years. Not the kind of invisible that happens to women who are overlooked or underestimated, though she had experienced both. This was a deliberate invisibility, engineered. Maintain the way you maintain a wound that hasn't fully closed with careful attention and the quiet understanding that exposure would cost you everything. She had chosen tonight's location herself. The Alderaan didn't take walk-ins. You needed a reservation, a name that meant something, or a contact who owed you a favor significant enough to get uncomfortable about. Zinara had the third, a former colleague from her Geneva days, a woman who now managed private bookings for Atlanta's most exclusive addresses, and who still felt guilty enough about what happened 3 years ago to answer the phone on the second ring. Zinara had told her she needed a table close to the private dining room. She hadn't explained why. The file on Rian Sokha was 47 pages long, and Zainara had memorized every word of it, not because she had been assigned to him. She hadn't. The organization she now worked for, a quiet intelligence contractor that officially did not exist and unofficially did work that governments preferred not to sign their names to, had placed her in Atlanta for something else. Entirely. A separate thread. A different name, on a different file. But threads have a way of connecting when you pull them in the dark. 3 weeks ago, a name had surfaced in the financial intercepts she was monitoring. A name she recognized. A name she had last seen signed at the bottom of a legal document that had ended her career, buried her reputation, and left her mother's medical bills entirely on her shoulders. Callum Vresh. Silent investor. No public profile. No digital footprint worth finding unless you knew exactly where to look. And Zainara, who spoke 7 languages and had spent 4 years translating the private communications of people who believed privacy was something money could permanently purchase, knew exactly where to look. Callum Vresh was the money behind the syndicate currently positioning itself to absorb Rian Sokha's Atlanta operation, and tonight, he had sent Orlan Merk to finish it. She had arrived at the Alderaan at 8:47 p.m., not through the main entrance, through the service corridor on the building's west side, using a keycard that her colleague had arranged, and that Zainara would return before midnight with the same casual efficiency with which she had borrowed it. She wore dark trousers and a structured jacket, nothing memorable, nothing that announced itself. She had spent years learning that the most dangerous thing a woman in her profession could do was be interesting to look at in the wrong room, so she had mastered the particular art of being present without being registered. She found a position near the frosted glass partition that separated the private dining room from the main floor, close enough to hear, far enough to be furniture. She ordered nothing. A half-empty glass of sparkling water sat in front of her like a prop in a play she was directing from the audience. Table 9 came into focus at 9:03 p.m., when Rian Sokha walked in. She had seen photographs. Photographs hadn't been adequate preparation. He moved through the room with a quietness that was almost architectural, as though the space reorganized itself slightly around him without being asked. He was younger than his reputation suggested, or perhaps his reputation was simply so large that people expected someone older. Late 30s, the charcoal shirt open at the collar where ink began its slow ascent toward his jaw. No jewelry, except a single ring on his right hand. Dark eyes that moved across a room the way a security camera moves systematically, without urgency, missing nothing. His man took a position near the entrance door without being told. Sokha sat down, folded his hands on the table, and became very still. Zinara recognized that stillness. She had seen it once before, in a Swiss negotiation room, in a man who had just realized he was the smartest person present and had decided to let everyone else perform their confidence before he dismantled it quietly. The difference was that Sokha didn't yet know what was coming. Orlan Merk arrived 4 minutes later, already performing. That was the word for it, performing. the handshake that lasted a half-second too long, the laugh that arrived slightly before the joke. The way he arranged the contract documents on the table with the careful pride of a man presenting something he had built, when in reality he was presenting something he had hollowed out. Zainara watched him the way you watch a clock when you already know what time the alarm is set for. The German lawyer Brauer, according to the file, sat to Soka's left with the particular tension of a man who had already raised his concerns through proper channels and been ignored, and was now deciding how much personal risk he was willing to absorb for a client who wasn't technically his. The conversation began in English. Merck translated into Korean with the smooth confidence of a man who had done this many times and had never once been caught doing it badly. Zainara listened, and within 6 minutes, she had counted 3 mistranslations, each one small enough to seem like imprecision, each one large enough, in aggregate, to be a cage. She set down her water glass, stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked toward table 9 with the quiet, unhurried certainty of a woman who had already calculated the cost of staying silent and decided she could not afford it. There is a particular kind of dangerous that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice, doesn't need to fill a room with noise to remind you it's there. It simply exists quietly, completely the way a deep current exists beneath still water. You don't know it's there until you're already in it, and by then, the surface is already gone. Ryun Soka was that kind of dangerous. Zainara had understood this from the file. She understood it differently now, standing 8 feet away from him, close enough to hear the specific cadence of Orlan Merck's Korean fluid, confident, and surgically dishonest. She stopped just outside the edge of the table's light, not close enough to be addressed, close enough to hear everything. Merck was midway through Clause 7, in the original German, as Brauer had drafted it. Clause 7 was a protection mechanism, a conditional exit built into the contract that allowed Soka to dissolve the partnership within 90 days if the American side investors failed to produce verified capital. Documentation. It was the only clause in the entire 40-page agreement that gave Soka any real leverage. The one exit, the one key. Merck translated it as a formality. This clause simply confirms the timeline for fund verification. He told Soka in Korean, his tone carrying the particular lightness of someone describing something boring on purpose. Standard language, nothing requiring your attention. Brauer's pen stopped moving. He didn't look up, but his pen stopped. Zainara saw it. That small, precise hesitation, the gesture of a man who had just heard something professionally unconscionable and was deciding, in real time, whether his integrity was worth the invoice he was owed. Soka's eyes moved to Brauer, just briefly, just enough. He had noticed too. This was the thing the file had not adequately captured about Ryun Soka, the quality of his attention. Photographs could document his face. Intelligence reports could catalog his organization, his territory, his history of calculated brutality when the situation required it. But no document had managed to convey the specific experience of being in the same room as his awareness. He missed nothing. He simply chose, with great deliberateness, what to respond to and what to file quietly away for later. The mistranslation of Clause 7, Zainara could see it in the almost imperceptible shift of his posture, had gone into the second category. He was letting Merck continue. He was building a complete picture before he moved. Smart, Zainara thought. And it's going to get him killed anyway. Because what Soka didn't know, what the file did know, and what Zainara had spent 3 weeks confirming through intercepts and financial threads that led back, always, to the same signature was that the ambush wasn't in the contract. The contract was the distraction. She had confirmed it 40 minutes ago, in a parking structure 2 blocks east of the Alderon, where a black SUV with false plates had been stationary for 3 hours, then a second one. Then, at 8:55 p.m., a third positioning itself at the building's rear exit with the kind of patient, unhurried precision that didn't belong to opportunists. This had been planned for weeks. Merck's job wasn't just to steal $40 million through fraudulent contract language. His job was to keep Soka at that table, confident and unsuspecting, until the men downstairs received the signal. The signing of the contract was the signal. Zainara had maybe 12 minutes. She moved closer. Not quickly. Quickly attracted attention, and attention at the wrong moment would collapse everything. She moved the way she had been trained to move in occupied spaces with purpose that looked like nothing, presence that registered as background. She was 2 feet from Soka's shoulder when his security man by the door moved. Not toward her, just shifted weight redistributing, attention recalibrating. He had clocked her the moment she left her table. Of course he had. A man like Soka didn't employ people who missed things. Zainara didn't stop moving. She kept her eyes on the table, her hands visible, her pace unhurried. Every signal her body could send that said, "I am not a threat," she sent it. Fluently, in the universal language of someone who understood exactly how quickly this could go wrong. She reached the edge of table 9. Merc glanced up with the reflexive, dismissive courtesy of a man who expected to see a server. He looked at her face. His expression recalibrated slightly, a flicker of something between curiosity and mild irritation, but he returned to the contract without speaking. She didn't look at Merc. She looked at Seokha. He was already looking at her, not with surprise, not with the particular masculine impatience of someone whose private meeting had been interrupted. He was looking at her the way he had looked at everything else in this room, with complete, unhurried attention, waiting to see what she was. Zanara leaned down. The chandelier hummed above them. Somewhere on the main floor, crystal touched crystal in a toast that meant nothing. She placed 4 words, in clean and precise Korean, directly into the space beside his ear. "Your translator just sold you out." Then she straightened and waited. Ryun Sokha did not move for 3 full seconds. Then, very slowly, he turned his head and looked at Orlan Merc, and what lived in that look was not anger. It was something quieter than anger, and considerably more final. Merc's smile didn't fall. It froze. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Zainara counted them. She had learned to count silences the way other people counted exits as a survival mechanism, a way of measuring how much time she had before a situation made its decision without her input. 1. Merc's frozen smile, his eyes moving from Sokha to Zainara and back again with the rapid, recalibrating panic of a man whose contingency plans were suddenly all arriving at once. 2. Brower's pen still on the table, his hands flat, the particular stillness of a man who had just understood that the room he was sitting in had changed categories entirely. 3. The security man by the door. Zainara felt him before she saw him shifting his weight forward, one hand moving toward the interior of his jacket with the slow, deliberate patience of someone waiting for a signal. 4. Sokha spoke. 1 word. Korean. Quietly, the security man's hand stopped. "Sit down." It took Zainara a full second to realize he was speaking to her. Not a request. Not quite a command. Something in between the tone of a man who was accustomed to occupying a middle register that most people never found, where authority lived without needing to perform itself. She sat. Not because she was afraid of him. She had been in rooms with dangerous men before, had translated their private negotiations, had sat inside the architecture of their power and remained unmoved by it. She sat because sitting was tactically correct, because standing made her a spectacle, and a spectacle right now would cost them both something they couldn't recover. She pulled the chair from the adjacent empty table and placed it at the corner of table 9, equidistant between Sokha and Merc, and sat down with the calm precision of someone who had been invited. Merc found his voice first. "I'm sorry, who exactly are you?" His Korean was smooth, practiced, the tone carrying just enough indignation to sound legitimate. "This is a private, be quiet." Sokha didn't look at him when he said it. He was still looking at Zainara. "You speak Korean." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How much?" "Enough to know that Clause 7 of the agreement you were about to sign does not say what you were told it says." She kept her voice level, unhurried. "And enough to know that the correct translation of what Mr. Brower has been attempting to communicate for the last 9 minutes is that the capital verification requirement has been structurally removed, which means the 90-day exit protection you believe you have does not legally exist in this version of the contract." The room was completely still. Brower exhaled a slow, controlled breath that carried 3 hours of professional frustration in it. Sokha's eyes didn't move from her face. "Who sent you?" "No one sent me." "That's not an answer. It's the only accurate one I have." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not softening, recalibrating. The way a lens adjusts, not because the subject has changed, but because the distance has been correctly measured for the first time. Merc stood up. The movement was too fast, too sudden, the action of a man whose internal calculation had just tipped from manageable to uncontainable. His chair scraped back against the marble floor with a sound that cut through the room like a statement. "Whatever she told you," he began in English, switching languages the way guilty men switch languages, looking for a version of the conversation they could still control. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's not part of this negotiation. She has no business. Sit down, Orlan." The use of his first name stopped Merc completely. Sokha had not raised his voice, had not changed his posture, had not done anything that would register, to an observer on the other side of the frosted glass, as anything other than a man conducting a quiet dinner conversation. But Merc sat down. Zainara had approximately 8 minutes. She knew this the way she knew most things in the field, not from certainty, but from pattern recognition. The SUVs in the garage had been stationary for over 3 hours. Stationary surveillance had a metabolic rhythm to it. Attention peaks, then plateaus, then sharpens again at the point of expected action. The expected action was the contract signing. The contract signing had been scheduled for 9:30 p.m. It was 9:22. She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Sokha." She spoke in Korean, deliberately, watching Merck's jaw tighten at the periphery of her vision. "I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to do it quickly, because the problem tonight is not only in this contract." Something moved behind his eyes. "The men who drafted this agreement didn't just want your signature," she continued. "They wanted you at this table, at this time, stationary, and believing the negotiation was complete. There are 3 vehicles currently positioned at your building's exits. They have been there since before you arrived." Brower made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Merck's hand moved toward his phone. Sokha's security man was across the room before the phone left the table. In the seconds that followed, Zanara did not move. She sat with her hands flat on the white linen, her breathing even, her eyes on Ryun Sokha's face, watching him process, prioritize, and arrive, with remarkable speed, at the same conclusion she had reached 40 minutes ago in a parking garage, 2 blocks east. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and without ceremony, in Korean, "Who are you?" And for the first time in 3 years, Zainara Vel considered telling someone the truth. She didn't answer him immediately. Not because she didn't have an answer. She had several, each one true in its own precise and carefully bounded way. She didn't answer because the question had landed somewhere unexpected, in a part of her she had spent 3 years successfully ignoring, and she needed exactly 2 seconds to seal it back up before it showed on her face. 2 seconds was all she allowed herself. "My name is Zanara Vel," she said. "That's all you need for tonight." Sokha looked at her the way he had looked at everything else in this room, completely, without rushing, and then, apparently deciding that tonight she was correct. He moved on. He spoke 2 quiet words to his security man. The room changed. It happened with a efficiency that Zainara recognized and respected, the kind of operational precision that didn't come from training alone, but from the specific education of having survived situations where imprecision had consequences that couldn't be appealed. Within 90 seconds, Brower had been moved to a separate table on the main floor, with quiet instructions that his evening's invoice would be settled in full and that he was free to leave through the main entrance whenever he chose. He went without argument, the relieved compliance of a man who had been waiting all evening for someone else to take responsibility for the room. Merck did not go anywhere. He sat very still, his phone face down on the table, his earlier performance of confidence entirely dissolved. What remained was something smaller and considerably less curated, a man without his costume, waiting to find out what happened next. Zanara didn't look at him. She was looking at the contract. It was the signature page that did it. She hadn't planned for it. She had planned for the vehicles in the garage, for the mistranslations, for the controlled chaos of the next 8 minutes. She had not planned for the moment when she turned the contract to its final page and saw, in the clean sans-serif typeface of a legitimate legal document, the name of the silent American investor whose capital was supposed to anchor the entire agreement, Callum Vresh. The room didn't change. The chandelier kept humming. Somewhere on the main floor, a woman laughed at something that wasn't very funny. Zanara's hand stayed flat on the page. She had known intellectually, for 3 weeks, that Callum's name was in this deal. She had seen it in the intercepts, had traced it through 3 layers of shell companies and 2 offshore accounts before it surfaced, clean and confident, in the investor documentation. She had known. Knowing and seeing are different things entirely. Callum Vresh had been her professional partner for 2 years. Not romantically. She wanted that noted clearly, in whatever internal record she kept of her own history, because people always assumed, and the assumption had always irritated her. Professionally, a colleague in the private translation and contract mediation firm they had built together from 2 clients and a shared office in Midtown Atlanta into something that had begun to matter. Something that had begun to be the kind of work she had crossed an ocean to do. He was charming, precise, and extraordinarily good at making people feel that their interests and his interests were the same thing. She had believed it too, for longer than she should have. The embezzlement, when it finally surfaced, had been elegant in its construction. 18 months of fraudulent contract amendments, each one small enough to escape immediate scrutiny, each one bearing Zainara's certification stamp which Callum had accessed. She later understood. During the 6 weeks she had been in Seoul for a long-term translation assignment that he had specifically recommended she take. By the time she returned, the paper trail was complete. Her name was on everything. His name was on nothing. She had spent 14 months trying to prove it. Had spent the money she didn't have on lawyers who were good, and then on lawyers who were cheaper, and then on a private investigator who found 3 useful things before she ran out of funds to pay him. Had spent the remaining months understanding, with the cold clarity that only arrives after hope has finished its work, that the system was not going to correct this for her, so she had gone invisible. Had taken the intelligence contractor position through a contact who valued her languages more than her reputation. Had sent money home to Atlanta every month for her mother's treatment at Emory. Had told herself, with some regularity, that this was temporary, that she was rebuilding, that the stillness was strategic and not surrender. She had almost believed it. And then 3 weeks ago, Callum Vresh's name had appeared in a financial intercept connected to a Korean organized crime territory negotiation in Atlanta. And she had understood, with the particular nausea of a pattern finally completing itself, that her presence in Atlanta had never been about the separate assignment her organization had sent her for. It had always been about this table, this contract, this name on this page. Callum had removed her from the board 3 years ago specifically so she would not be here tonight. Had destroyed her career, her reputation, and her mother's financial security as a preventative measure, because he had known, even then, that a deal this size would eventually require someone of her specific capability to unravel it. He had been right. He had simply been 3 years too early. She became aware that Soka was watching her, not impatiently, just watching, the way he did everything, completely. She lifted her hand from the page, turned to face him. "The man who funded this ambush," she said quietly, in Korean, "is the same man who destroyed my career 3 years ago to make sure I wouldn't be in this room tonight." Soka was silent for a moment. Then, she didn't answer him immediately. Not because she didn't have an answer, she had several, each one true in its own precise and carefully bounded way. She didn't answer because the question had landed somewhere unexpected, in a part of her she had spent 3 years successfully ignoring, and she needed exactly 2 seconds to seal it back up before it showed on her face. 2 seconds was all she allowed herself. "My name is Zainara Vell," she said. "That's all you need for tonight." Soka looked at her the way he had looked at everything else in this room completely, without rushing, and then, apparently deciding that tonight she was correct, he moved on. He spoke 2 quiet words to his security man. The room changed. It happened with a efficiency that Zainara recognized and respected, the kind of operational precision that didn't come from training alone, but from the specific education of having survived situations where imprecision had consequences that couldn't be appealed. Within 90 seconds, Brower had been moved to a separate table on the main floor with quiet instructions that his evening's invoice would be settled in full and that he was free to leave through the main entrance whenever he chose. He went without argument, the relieved compliance of a man who had been waiting all evening for someone else to take responsibility for the room. Merck did not go anywhere. He sat very still, his phone face down on the table, his earlier performance of confidence entirely dissolved. What remained was something smaller and considerably less curated, a man without his costume, waiting to find out what happened next. Zainara didn't look at him. She was looking at the contract. It was the signature page that did it. She hadn't planned for it. She had planned for the vehicles in the garage, for the mistranslations, for the controlled chaos of the next 8 minutes. She had not planned for the moment when she turned the contract to its final page and saw, in the clean sans serif typeface of a legitimate legal document, the name of the silent American investor whose capital was supposed to anchor the entire agreement. Callum Vresh. The room didn't change. The chandelier kept humming. Somewhere on the main floor, a woman laughed at something that wasn't very funny. Zainara's hand stayed flat on the page. She had known intellectually, for 3 weeks, that Callum's name was in this deal. She had seen it in the intercepts, had traced it through 3 layers of shell companies and 2 offshore accounts before it surfaced, clean and confident, in the investor documentation. She had known. Knowing and seeing are different things entirely. Callum Vresh had been her professional partner for 2 years. Not romantically, she wanted that noted clearly, in whatever internal record she kept of her own history, because people always assumed, and the assumption had always irritated her. Professionally, a colleague in the private translation and contract mediation firm they had built together from 2 clients and a shared office in Midtown Atlanta into something that had begun to matter, something that had begun to be the kind of work she had crossed an ocean to do. He was charming, precise, and extraordinarily good at making people feel that their interests and his interests were the same thing. She had believed it too, for longer than she should have. The embezzlement, when it finally surfaced, had been elegant in its construction. 18 months of fraudulent contract amendments, each one small enough to escape immediate scrutiny, each one bearing Zainara's certification stamp which Callum had accessed. She later understood. during the 6 weeks she had been in Seoul for a long-term translation assignment that he had specifically recommended she take. By the time she returned, the paper trail was complete. Her name was on everything. His name was on nothing. She had spent 14 months trying to prove it. Had spent the money she didn't have on lawyers who were good, and then on lawyers who were cheaper, and then on a private investigator who found 3 useful things before she ran out of funds to pay him. Had spent the remaining months understanding, with the cold clarity that only arrives after hope has finished its work, that the system was not going to correct this for her, so she had gone invisible. Had taken the intelligence contractor position through a contact who valued her languages more than her reputation. Had sent money home to Atlanta every month for her mother's treatment at Emory. Had told herself, with some regularity, that this was temporary, that she was rebuilding, that the stillness was strategic, and not surrender. She had almost believed it. And then 3 weeks ago, Callum Vresh's name had appeared in a financial intercept, connected to a Korean organized crime territory negotiation in Atlanta. And she had understood, with the particular nausea of a pattern finally completing itself, that her presence in Atlanta had never been about the separate assignment her organization had sent her for. It had always been about this table, this contract, this name on this page. Callum had removed her from the board 3 years ago specifically so she would not be here tonight, had destroyed her career, her reputation, and her mother's financial security as a preventative measure, because he had known, even then, that a deal this size would eventually require someone of her specific capability to unravel it. He had been right. He had simply been 3 years too early. She became aware that Sokha was watching her, not impatiently, just watching, the way he did everything, completely. She lifted her hand from the page, turned to face him. "The man who funded this ambush," she said quietly, in Korean, "is the same man who destroyed my career 3 years ago to make sure I wouldn't be in this room tonight." Sokha was silent for a moment. Then, "And yet here you are. And yet here I am." Something that was almost not quite, but almost a smile crossed his face. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. "And yet here you are. And yet here I am." Something that was almost not quite, but almost a smile crossed his face. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. The next 4 minutes were operational. Zainara appreciated that. She functioned better in operational time, the compressed, clarified version of reality where everything unnecessary fell away and what remained was only the sequence of actions required to survive the next immediate interval. No history, no grief, no Callum Vresh and the specific weight of his name on a page she hadn't expected to touch tonight. Just the problem in front of her, and what needed to happen next. Sokha had shifted entirely into that same register. She recognized it in him the way you recognize a language. You also speak the subtle restructuring of attention, the economy of movement, the way his instructions to his security man became shorter and more precise. He was no longer the man conducting a dinner negotiation. He was something older than that, and considerably more practiced. He issued 4 instructions in rapid Korean. Zainara translated them automatically, in her own mind, before she caught herself doing it, a reflex so deeply embedded it operated below conscious thought. Secure the east corridor. Confirm vehicle positions. Move Merck to the interior room. Nobody leaves without my word. His security man disappeared. Merck had stopped pretending. That was the thing about men like Orlan Merck. Their performance was load-bearing. Remove the context that made the performance necessary, and what remained was surprisingly small. He sat with his hands folded on the table in the manner of someone who had decided that stillness was his best remaining option, his eyes moving between Zainara and the door, with the calculations of a man who had already run the numbers and didn't like any of the results. Zainara looked at him directly for the first time. "How many men in the garage?" she asked, in English, cleanly. Merck said nothing. "Orlan." She kept her voice neutral. Conversational, almost. "The vehicles are already confirmed. I'm asking for the number of occupants because it affects what happens in the next 3 minutes. And what happens in the next 3 minutes affects whether you leave this building tonight in a condition that allows you to make subsequent decisions about your life." A pause. 6, Merck said. 2 per vehicle. Armed? He looked at her with something between resentment and exhausted admission. "Yes." "Signal protocol? How are you supposed to confirm the signing?" Text message. 1 word. "To Callum directly?" The name landed visibly. Merck's composure fractured along a very specific line. The line of a man who had believed until this precise moment that the architecture of the operation was more concealed than it apparently was. "You know about Callum," he said. Not a question. "I know considerably more about Callum than you do," Zainara said. "Which is why I'm still in this room and you're currently deciding whether to be cooperative." Sokha had been listening. He hadn't interrupted, hadn't redirected. had simply allowed the exchange to complete itself, gathering information with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that data collected now was leverage available later. When Merck finished speaking, Soka looked at Zanara. You speak German also? Yes. And what other languages? 7 total. Korean, German, French, Mandarin, Japanese, Arabic, and English. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly more the specific quality of attention that arrived when something confirmed a suspicion that had already been forming. You were not sent here tonight to watch me, he said. It wasn't a question either. He appeared to be largely done with questions. No. Then what were you sent for? Zinara considered the boundaries of what she could answer. They were narrow but navigable. A separate matter. Your operation wasn't my assignment. You became relevant when a name in your investor documentation connected to an active thread I was already monitoring. Callum Vresh. Yes. Soka was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, it was with the deliberate precision of a man selecting exactly the words he intended. No more. This man destroyed your career. Yes. And tonight was his attempt to destroy mine. Tonight was his attempt to take your territory, your capital, and once the contract was signed, and you were leaving the building your life, the chandelier hummed above them. On the main floor, the evening continued its expensive, oblivious performance crystal, and conversation and the soft percussion of a room full of people who believed the world was exactly the size of their table. He made an error, Soka said finally. He made several, Zanara said. But the significant one was 3 years ago. Soka looked at her. Removing me. His security man returned at 9:31 p.m., 1 minute past the scheduled signing. Somewhere in the parking garage, 6 men in 3 vehicles were looking at phones that hadn't received a single word and beginning the specific recalculation of an operation that had missed its window. The security man spoke quietly in Korean. Zainara caught it. Fully east corridor secured. Building management contacted. Police presence requested on a pretext that would hold for approximately 20 minutes before requiring a more permanent solution. 20 minutes was enough. Soka stood. He straightened his jacket with the unhurried composure of a man rising from a dinner that had gone exactly as he intended, which, Zanara reflected, was either extraordinary self-possession or the most refined performance she had ever witnessed. Possibly both. He looked at Merck. Then he looked at Zanara, and something in the look was different from every look that had preceded it. Less assessment, more acknowledgement. The specific recognition one professional extends to another when the work has been done correctly under difficult conditions. Miss Vell, he said. Mr. Soka. We will continue this conversation somewhere less decorative. It wasn't a request, but for reasons she didn't immediately examine, Zanara didn't treat it as a command either. She simply stood, straightened her jacket, and followed him toward the door. The night air hit her like a correction. After the Alderon's climate-controlled perfection, the engineered temperature, the curated scent of expensive candles and older money, the September Atlanta heat was almost aggressive in its honesty. Thick and immediate, the kind of air that reminded you that the city existed outside the buildings that tried to pretend otherwise. Zainara walked 3 steps behind Soka, through the Alderon's private exit, a side door that opened onto a narrow service corridor, and then onto Peachtree Road, through a passage that didn't appear on the Saito building's public floor plan. His security man led. A second man she hadn't previously clocked fell into position behind her, with the quiet professionalism of someone who had been there all evening and had simply chosen not to be visible until now. She noted him without reacting. She understood the position she was currently in, not captive, not quite guest, occupying the specific intermediate category of someone whose value had been established, but whose loyalty had not yet been assessed. She had been in this category before, in other cities, with other dangerous men. The rules were consistent across languages and cultures. Be useful, be legible, don't reach for anything suddenly. She kept her hands at her sides and her pace even. They were 12 feet from the exit when the corridor lights went out. Not a power failure, the emergency strips along the floor remained active, casting the passage in a thin, utilitarian red. This was deliberate. Someone who knew the building systems, who had access to the secondary electrical panel on the basement level, had made a decision. The security man in front stopped. Soka stopped. Zanara stopped. 4 seconds of complete stillness, and then from the far end of the corridor, where the passage bent left toward the loading dock, she heard footsteps. Not 1 set, 3, possibly 4, moving with the compressed urgency of people who had abandoned patience in favor of something more immediate. The operation in the garage hadn't waited for the missed signal. Someone had made a command decision. Everything happened in the compressed, overlapping simultaneity that Zainara had been trained to process, and that she had never fully gotten used to the security man in front, moving left and drawing in one fluid motion. The man behind her, placing a hand firmly on her shoulder and redirecting her toward the wall. Voices in the dark, Korean and English colliding in the narrow space, the specific percussion of a confrontation that hadn't yet decided what it was going to be. She pressed flat against the wall, counted bodies by sound 4 incoming, 2 of Soka's visible, at least one more she couldn't place. The red emergency lighting turned everything into shapes and suggestion, depth perception flattened, faces unreadable. A shape came around the corner fast, too fast for the space, the movement of someone running on adrenaline rather than training, and it was aimed at her specifically. Not at Soka, not at the security detail, at her. The one variable in tonight's operation that hadn't been anticipated, and therefore needed to be immediately removed. She had approximately 1 second to make a decision. She used it. The thing about 7 languages was that the discipline required to hold them the years of training the mind to switch registers completely, to inhabit different syntactical structures and tonal systems simultaneously produced, as a secondary effect, a particular quality of physical awareness, a heightened sensitivity to pattern and interruption, to the grammar of bodies in space. She had also, during her 3 years with the intelligence contractor, completed 18 months of close-quarters training that her organization described in official documentation as security awareness, and that had been, in practice, considerably more specific than that. She sidestepped, used the shape's own momentum. One hand on the wrist, redirection rather than resistance, the economy of someone who understood that force was a resource and waste was unprofessional. The shape hit the wall where she had been standing and lost 2 seconds recovering. 2 seconds was enough. Soka's second security man was already there. It was over in 90 seconds. Not cleanly, nothing in a corridor that narrow and that dark was going to be clean, but completely. 4 men, 2 of them now considerably less mobile than they had been, the other 2 making the rapid cost-benefit calculation that men in their position made when the operation had clearly passed the point of salvage. They made the correct calculation. The corridor was quiet. Zainara straightened, checked herself systematically, the professional inventory of someone assessing damage, before adrenaline finished its work and pain caught up with the body's accounting. Nothing serious. A bruise forming on her left forearm where the wall had made its opinion known. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder seam. She looked at the torn seam for a moment. She had liked this jacket. Soka was looking at her, in the red emergency light. His expression was difficult to read, but she had been reading difficult expressions across difficult lighting, in difficult rooms for long enough to recognize the particular quality of reassessment, the recalibration of a prior estimate. "You're not a linguist," he said. "I'm an exceptional linguist," she said. "I'm also other things." "What other things?" "Complicated ones." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, his security detail was managing the corridor with efficient, practiced discretion, the cleanup of men who had done this before, and would do it again, and felt no particular way about it. "The vehicle," he said finally to his man. Then to Zainara, without looking at her. "You're bleeding." She looked down. Her right hand, the wall, apparently, had been more emphatic than she'd registered. "It's minor," she said. Nevertheless, he moved toward the exit. "Come." She followed. Outside, Peachtree Road continued its indifferent Friday night headlights and music and the city's permanent, luminous hum. Nobody on the sidewalk looked twice. They never did. Hanwol didn't have a sign. That was the first thing Zainara noticed when the vehicle turned onto a narrow street in Doraville, that her mental map of Atlanta didn't have a name for a block that existed in the specific urban grammar of a community that had built itself for itself, without particular interest in being found by anyone who hadn't already been told where to look. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a building, whose upper 2 levels appeared residential. Its windows were covered from the inside with frosted film. A single light above the entrance, warm, amber, the color of something that had been here long before the city's recent memory of itself. No name on the door, no hours posted. The vehicle stopped. Soka's security man got out first, assessed the street with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was as automatic as breathing, then opened the door. Zainara stepped out. The air here was different from Buckhead, less performance, more permanence. The smell of a neighborhood that cooked with its windows open and didn't apologize for it. Somewhere nearby, a radio played something she recognized as trot, the Korean musical genre that older generations carried across oceans like a photograph in a coat pocket. She followed Soka through the unmarked door. Inside, Hanwol was 3 tables and a kitchen. That was it. 3 round tables covered in dark cloth, low lighting, no menu visible, a kitchen separated from the dining area by a simple partition through which came the specific, layered smell of a broth that had been running since morning. A woman in her 60s emerged from behind the partition, looked at Soka with the unremarkable recognition of someone who had seen him many times, and disappeared again without speaking. 2 of the 3 tables were empty. At the third, a man sat with a cup of tea and a newspaper folded to the crossword. Late 50s, heavyset. The particular comfort of a man occupying a space that was entirely his, not owned, but claimed, the way certain people claim certain chairs in certain rooms through sheer consistency of presence. He looked up when they entered, looked at Soka, then at Zanara, then back at Soka, with the expression of a man recalibrating an evening he had believed he understood. Soka spoke to him in Korean, brief, informational. The condensed version of a situation delivered to someone who needed the facts and not the texture. The man listened, set down his crossword, looked at Zainara again, not with suspicion exactly, but with the thorough attention of someone whose professional history had taught him that the details other people considered minor were frequently the ones that mattered most. Then he nodded once and returned to his tea. They sat at the table farthest from the door. The woman from the kitchen brought water, and then, without being asked, 2 bowls of something that smelled like the best possible version of a thing Zainara couldn't immediately name. She looked at it. Then, at Soka. "Eat," he said. "You've earned it." She picked up the spoon. It was galbatang short rib broth, slow and deep, and constructed with the kind of patience that couldn't be replicated by anything other than time. She hadn't eaten since noon. The bowl was extraordinary. She didn't say this, but something in the way she set the spoon down after the first mouthful must have been legible, because the woman from the kitchen appeared briefly in the partition doorway, assessed the table, and seemed satisfied before vanishing again. They ate without speaking for several minutes. Zainara had learned, early in her career, that silence at a table was a form of communication that what people chose not to fill it with was frequently more informative than what they said. Soka's silence was not uncomfortable. It was not strategic in the way that some men used silence, as a pressure tool, a mechanism for making the other person speak first, and therefore concede something. It was simply the silence of a man who was thinking, and who saw no reason to perform otherwise. She respected it enough to match it. When he finally spoke, it was without preamble. 3 years ago, he said. The documents that were fraudulent, what were they attached to? She looked at him. Why? Because Kalimvresh has been operating in connected spaces for at least 5 years, and because the specific capability he chose to neutralize, he looked at her directly, suggests he was planning this particular operation considerably longer than 3 years ago. The bowl of galbatang was warm between her hands. They were attached to a series of private contract mediations, she said carefully. International. Several involved Korean corporate interests. At least 2 involved parties I later understood to have connections to organized capital in Seoul. Soka was quiet for a moment. You translated documents connected to my competitors, he said. 3 years ago. Before you knew what they were connected to. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man completing a picture whose edges he had already mapped. Apparently, Zainara said. And Kalimvresh was ensuring that when the time came for this specific deal for this territory, this capital, this particular $40 million agreement, the one person capable of reading the room in every language simultaneously would be discredited, invisible, or both. Both, he said. A pause. He underestimated the invisible part, Soka said. Most people do, Zainara said. The radio from somewhere outside continued its trot melody unhurried. A little melancholy, the sound of something being carried a long distance by someone who had decided the wait was worth it. Soka set down his spoon. I have a proposal, he said. Zainara looked at him. I assumed you might, she said. He took his time getting to it. That was the first thing she noticed, that he didn't rush toward the proposal the way men who were uncertain of their offer rushed toward it, filling the approach with justifications and preemptive concessions. He refilled his water glass, straightened the edge of a napkin that didn't need straightening, performed the small, unhurried rituals of a man who had learned that the architecture of a conversation mattered as much as its content. She waited. My organization operates across 14 cities, he began. Seoul, Tokyo, Osaka, Singapore, Hong Kong, Sydney, Vancouver, Toronto, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, and Atlanta. He said the names without emphasis, the way you recite a list of facts that require no decoration. In each of those cities, there are negotiations, contracts, relationships that require precise communication between parties who do not share a language and cannot afford imprecision. You employ translators, Zainara said. I employ people who speak languages, he said. There is a difference. She understood the distinction immediately, had, in fact, built her entire professional identity around it for the better part of a decade. Speaking a language was mechanical. Translating was interpretation, the ability to carry not just words but intent, subtext, the specific cultural weight of what was being communicated beneath what was being said. You had Orlin Merk, she said. I had someone I believed was translating, he said. Tonight established the distinction clearly. The woman from the kitchen appeared. Removed the empty bowls with the wordless efficiency of someone who understood that the table's conversation was not her business, and disappeared again. What I am offering you, Sokha continued, is a position, official, in the sense that it would come with a formal contract, one that I would encourage you to review in whatever language you prefer, with independent counsel of your choosing. A pause. Unofficial, in the sense that it would not appear on a resume or in any public record. What would the position entail? You would travel when required. You would be present at any negotiation, contract review, or meeting where multilingual communication is a factor. You would translate what is said completely, accurately, without omission or amendment, and you would alert me to any discrepancy between what I am told and what is actually being communicated. In any of your 14 cities. In any of them, yes. Zinara looked at the table for a moment. And the other things your organization does in those 14 cities. It wasn't a question. Exactly. More an acknowledgement that the conversation they were having existed inside a larger reality that neither of them was pretending otherwise. Sokha met it directly. Whatever else my organization does, he said, you would translate. Nothing more. You would not be asked to participate in, facilitate, authorize, or have knowledge of operational matters outside your specific function. He paused. I want a linguist, not a soldier. Not a strategist, not a conscience. Another pause, shorter. I have sufficient of all three. Zinara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the trot melody had given way to something slower, a woman's voice, unhurried and certain. The kind of singing that knew exactly where it was going and wasn't concerned about the time it took to arrive. She thought about her mother's billing statement. The number at the bottom, printed in the clean, indifferent typeface of institutional accounting. The way it looked in the morning before she'd had enough coffee to manage her response to it. She thought about her organization, the intelligence contractor whose current assignment she had been, technically, pursuing, when tonight interrupted. They would have questions. She would have answers that were true in the ways that mattered, and incomplete in the ways that were manageable. She thought about Callum Vresh, whose name was on a contract that had been designed to end a man's life, and who had spent 3 years believing that the person most capable of unraveling his architecture had been permanently removed from the board. She thought about the torn seam on her jacket shoulder, and the bruise forming along her forearm, and the way the galbatang had tasted like something that had been waiting patiently to be exactly what it was. The contract you mentioned, she said. The formal one. Yes. I have specific requirements. Something in his expression, not surprise, but a quality adjacent to it. The recalibration of a man who had expected negotiation and was discovering, in real time, that what he was getting was something more structured than that. State them, he said. Compensation benchmarked to senior diplomatic interpreter rates. I'll provide the current international standard. Payment structured to include a separate allocation for medical expenses connected to a third party, non-negotiable and index-linked. She kept her voice even. Professional. The voice she had used in Geneva boardrooms and Seoul negotiation suites, and every other room where she had been the most qualified person present and the least powerful. 48 hours notice for non-urgent travel. The right to refuse any specific assignment with cause, defined as any situation where my presence would constitute a legal liability under the jurisdiction in question. And one additional term. Sokha waited. Callum Vresh, she said. Whatever your organization's response to tonight's operation, whatever form that response takes, in whatever timeline you determine appropriate, I want to be in the room when he understands that I was the reason it failed. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man examining a term and finding it, on reflection, entirely reasonable. Agreed, Sokha said. He extended his hand across the table. Zinara looked at it for precisely 1 second, the honest, unperformed second of a woman who understood exactly what she was reaching across, and then she took it. His grip was firm, brief, conclusive. Welcome, he said, in Korean, to a room where honest people are difficult to find. She held his gaze. And remarkably easy to lose, she finished. His eyes held something then, not warmth exactly, but the specific acknowledgement of a person recognizing, across a table in an unmapped restaurant in Doraville, that the person opposite them was not going to be what they expected. Neither of them looked away first. 3 weeks passed. They were not uneventful weeks. No week in Zainara's life had been uneventful since the morning she had opened a legal document in a midtown Atlanta office and understood, with the cold arriving clarity of a diagnosis, that everything she had built was gone. But these 3 weeks had a different quality to their difficulty. Less weight, more direction. She had submitted her formal resignation to the intelligence contractor through the correct channels, using the correct language, with the correct amount of professional ambiguity about her reasons. Her handler, a pragmatic woman named Solis, who had recruited her in London 4 years ago, and who expressed affection exclusively through operational efficiency, had read the resignation, asked 2 questions, received 2 answers that were true in the ways that mattered, and approved the separation with the particular briskness of someone who understood that certain assets were more useful outside the organization than in it, and who preferred those assets to leave before they became complicated. Zainara had cleared her apartment in southwest Atlanta in 4 hours. She had visited her mother at Emory on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the specific quality of hospital light that flattened everything into honesty, and had told her, not everything, but enough, that things were changing, that the billing statement's number at the bottom was no longer the thing it had been. Her mother had looked at her for a long moment with the particular perception of a woman who had raised a child fluent in 7 languages and had therefore learned, early, to listen to what wasn't being said. "Are you safe?" she had asked. Zainara had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "More than I was," she had said. Her mother had accepted this with the grace of a woman who understood that "more than I was" sometimes the most honest answer available, and that honest answers from her daughter were worth more than comfortable ones. The work was what she had been told it would be, precise, demanding, and entirely contained within its stated parameters. She traveled to Chicago on day 4 for a real estate negotiation between Soka's organization and a Korean-American development consortium whose lead attorney spoke 3 languages and trusted none of them. She sat at the table, translated completely and accurately, flagged 2 instances of deliberate ambiguity in the contract language, and returned to Atlanta on a Thursday evening with the specific satisfaction of work done correctly. Soka had been present for the Chicago meeting. He operated, she was learning, with a consistency that she found professionally clarifying. He said what he meant, expected what he asked for, and did not require the performance of deference that some men in his position substituted for actual respect. He addressed her by her last name in professional settings. He did not explain her presence to people who asked. He simply said, in whatever language the room required, "Miss Vell is my translator," with a finality that rendered follow-up questions unnecessary. She had been called worse things. On day 11, she sat in on a Vancouver call that required simultaneous management of Korean, Mandarin, and English, 3 separate streams of communication, each carrying its own subtext, each requiring independent interpretation. Afterward, Soka's man, the broad-shouldered security lead whose name she had learned was Juno, had looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of impressed, which mostly manifested as a slightly longer than usual silence before he looked away. She considered it a reasonable review. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after Hanwol. Cream-colored, heavy stock. Her name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Precise, unhurried, the penmanship of someone who had been taught to write by someone who believed it mattered. No return address. She opened it at her kitchen table with her coffee, in the early Atlanta morning light that came through her new apartment's east-facing window, a different apartment, different neighborhood, the Southwest Atlanta billing statement replaced by something that no longer required management by hope alone. Inside the envelope was a single card. Same cream stock. Same weight. 4 words, in Korean, written in the same precise hand. She read them once, set the card down, picked up her coffee, read them again. The Korean language has a specific grammatical construction for statements that exist between declaration and question utterances that carry the weight of both without fully committing to either. It is a construction that English handles clumsily, forcing a choice between assertion and inquiry that Korean considers unnecessary. The statement simply exists, in the honest, intermediate space, waiting for the other person to determine which of its possible meanings they would like to receive. The 4 words on the card existed in that space. Translated literally, they said, "I see you clearly now." But the construction, the specific grammatical register Soka had chosen, carried a secondary meaning that any fluent speaker would recognize immediately. Not just observation, acknowledgement. The particular Korean expression of recognition that implied not merely that a person had been seen, but that what had been seen was considered and found to be something worth the seeing. 7 languages, and not one of them had a single word for what that meant. Zanera sat with the card for a long time. The morning light moved across her kitchen table in its unhurried way, indifferent to the specific weight of 4 words in a language that did more with less than any other she carried. She thought about the Alderaan, about a chandelier humming silence and a frozen smile and a dangerous man who hadn't known, until she told him, that the room he was sitting in had already decided his fate. She thought about Callum Vresh, whose reckoning was coming. She understood, with the patient certainty of something that had already been set in motion and required only time. She thought about her mother's question in the hospital light. "Are you safe?" More than I was. She picked up the card. Read the 4 words one final time. Then she set it carefully on the table, in a patch of morning light, and reached for her phone. She had a response to write. It would take her 4 words also, in Korean, naturally.